Welcome to Everything is Changing. In each episode, we focus on circular economy, ecosystem restoration, energy transformation, sustainable mobility, and water resources. I am Ahmetcan Uzlaşık. Perspective is everything, and everything is changing. Today's episode is a special one. I'm joined by Alain Hubert, legendary explorer, engineer, and the co-founder of the International Polar Foundation. From crossing the Arctic Ocean to building the world's first zero-emission research station in Antarctica, Hubert's life is a story of passion, resilience, and climate action. Let's dive into the extremes and what they teach us about our planet and ourselves. First of all, I want to start by asking something on a personal level. You had an extraordinary career as an engineer, explorer, and mountaineer. Could you tell us what first drove you to the polar regions and how these experiences shaped your worldview?
Well, it's a long way to go. First of all, it's not a career, it's passion, because I don't earn money with that. But I start my childhood next to a forest, and I spend those. I used to tell that my first expedition were, in the forest here near Brussels. Long time ago, we had lots of snow in the winter, so it's completely different. But it's how I start running out in the middle of the nature, and then a bit later, when I was 15 years old, I discovered mountains. One day, I was just doing a easy climb, and above the clouds. And for me, it was the sunset, and that was a revelation. I knew that I would be becoming a mountaineer, and that was the beginning. But being a mountaineering means that you are not fighting against someone or competing. You are in front of yourself in the middle of the nature, and the nature which is really harsh, rude, and don't care about you. So that was something very important in my life, realizing that we are supported by the earth, by nature, and not the opposite thing, that we can dominate everything on earth and that we are much more powerful than nature. That was a time where I was able to build confidence on myself on one hand, and on the other hand, this passion of mountaineering. And a bit later, I started doing expedition in the Himalayas, which is even more extreme and difficult. And it is only when I was about 38 years old that I decided to try to reach the North Pole. That's completely different, but it was one of my dreams when I was a kid, because of the books hidden somewhere in the library at home. And then I went to the North Pole from Canada. It's an expedition of about 76 days in the middle of this ocean. That we don't know that the Arctic, in fact, it's an ocean covered by ice, moving all the time, even if it's -50°C. And so it's really a universe where you can never knowing what's going to happen in coming hours. So you have to live into this environment, and in front of the danger, the only way to save your life, to go ahead, it's to change your behavior. That was for a sportsman like me, with quite of ambitious. We as a sport person, we are a bit ambitious. But then you realize that to succeed or not, you have to be able to take this nature in account. Then that was one thing. And I reached the North Pole after this long journey, and it was a big storm in the middle of nowhere. And when you arrive at the North Pole, you're not there anymore. At that time, it was in 1994, I had the first GPS, big stuff of 1.5 kilo, which failed a few times. But anyway, we were be able to attest that that we were at the North Pole. But when you are in the North Pole, a minute after, you're not at the North Pole anymore. And this is something a bit disturbing. So then I decided to go on the other side. and look at what's going on down there, which is the South Pole. And that's important in my life because doing so, I decided to attempt the crossing, the longest crossing of this continent, over about 4,000 kilometers. And I've been asked by French to do some science for them crossing new territories, and which I accept. And I had to study a little bit, what are those scientists doing there in the middle of nowhere? Finally, like a bit everyone, you say, so why do we have to go there? Well, what's the role of the poles in our daily life, finally? And, well, you might know that in Antarctica, in fact, the temperature is always below 0 degrees Celsius, which means that the snow is not melting. And, these bubbles are trapped into the crystals of snow. And after a long time, they stuck. This snow is, becoming slowly ice. Scientists were able to gradually drill through the ice. It was a long time ago, 1957. It was the International Geophysical Polar Year, and it was a French who put in this during the overwintering, these 8 months of quite darkness in Antarctica. He put some ice in his glass of whiskey, and he saw some bubble coming out. That was the beginning of all the science which has been developed to understand, what can we get from all these bubbles, which are since hundreds, thousands of years trapped in the ice. So the first big drilling went about more than 3,000 meters deep, and we were able, with this project called EPICA, to retrace the observation of the low atmosphere going back to 800,000 years in the past. So it's 8 glacial and interglacial periods. We were able to discover the variation of the concentration of the CO2. And we are speaking about that all the time today because it's the main greenhouse gas, which is, when it is in the atmosphere, stays for more than 100 years. So it means that thanks to the analysis of the ice top, and we're not going to go into details, but we know the origin of the problem that we have to face today. And as it's a question concentration of CO2 that we know that is an anthropogenic cause, it's caused by the exploitation of the kind of energy, the fossil fuel energy. And so that we know that we have to work on the energy to change our society and to try to continue to live here all together on this planet. So that was for me something as an engineer by training. When you know the cause of a problem, you know what you have to do to work on the solution. And that's the first time in our human species that we know that there are limits, and we know as well what to do to try to cope with this limit and mitigation or adaptation to this. And and then we were lucky to succeed as well on expedition. You know, that's another thing that you learn when you do expedition is that you do mistake. We all do mistake. The difference between people is the one who can learn from their mistake and the other one.
Was that one of the initial visions you had when co-founding the International Polar Foundation?
Because after that, I saw little kids playing at Polar Explorer here in Brussels, and some very high-level climatologists asking me, so what can we do together in the future? Because we had organized an exhibit about the history of this country. Belgium is a very small country, but when we speak about poles and polar science, we played a role because the first overwintering in 1897-99 was a Belgian expedition, the first scientific and international expedition. So that's why in Belgium there are something in our history, that which make us be part of the geophysical polar year in 1957-59, becoming one of the 12 founding countries of the Antarctic Treaty. And as you might know, the Antarctic is a continent of 4,000 million square kilometers. It's as big as twice the size of the United States about. And it's surrounded by an ocean which is quite cold. It's one of the two cold source of our climate. Very often we forget that the climate is an exchange between the low atmosphere and biosphere in the ocean, and that we see now that when the Arctic Ocean is melting more and more during the summer, instead of being almost dark, also white and reflecting at 80% the energy coming from the sun, it's absorbed. So there are a change in the atmospheric circulation, which is quite recent, and it's definitely recent that people here in Europe are starting to understand that they are a problem. So, but in the Antarctic, it's of course also white. The continent covered by 98% by snow, but this ice is a continental ice. So when it's melting, you all know now that it has a direct effect on the sea level rise. So meaning that starting at that time, it was in the 1957, it was the first time that about 12 nations built stations basically around the sea to start to see, okay, what do we know about this big continent? It is important or not, etc. So then, as a country, Belgium, after a few years, abandoned the station that they had built because most probably government were not very interested by that. And they say, so why do we have to spend money to be there? Then it was, a decision to let it go.
Princess Elizabeth Antarctica Station was truly a groundbreaking project, still the world's only zero-emission polar research station. What were the main challenges in building and operating such a facility in one of the harshest environments on Earth?
Yeah, the idea, anyway, was after my big expedition in the Antarctica to start a foundation which as a platform between science and society to explain, to do lots, basically education, to explain why science is today important as an incentive to look for the solution and change the world. And then the station came just a little bit after, a few years after, realizing that in fact, the location of the former Belgian station in Antarctica was completely isolated and apparently important for science. Then we decided to go and see the government and to propose them to build a new station. Scientists at that time said, okay, we don't need a station along the coast. We have to go inland to have access to the plateau. And I had started my expedition from this location as a symbol, crossing the whole continent towards the other side. So I knew that this area, we would have possibility of finding a place close to the mountains. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in 1992, nations of the treaty decide to set an environmental protocol, which is called the Madrid Protocol, which advise every country's member of the treaty to try to be more careful with the environment, to do their best to, let's say, respect the environment. But of course, no one is, as very often in a big international treaty, you do whatever you want finally. And so it was not really effective. So having made the decision to build a new station, it came natural for us to say, okay, why not trying to do a zero emission? Because bringing fuel in Antarctica, it's hugely expensive. And so then we conceived the first smart grid of this kind. And gradually, the station became fully zero emission. We work on the water treatment system, which is nowadays is completely 99.6% perfect regarding the environment by the end of the season, when we stop the treatment with the bioreactor, because we don't need to be in Antarctica during the winter. There are only one person at the station. We call him James, and James is the computer. because our station doesn't need people in Antarctica during 8 months, because all energy is provided in the winter by the wind, convert, stored in the batteries, and it makes the whole activities, monitoring, sending of data, etc., working without us. We control that by satellite.
You thought that one of the initial thoughts you had when co-founding this organization was to close the gap between climate, science, and society, and it's been more than 2 decades. How do you see the situation right now? Are people more concerned or taking more action toward climate change in polar regions?
Well, the polar regions, it's not in the polar region that you have to take action. First of all, you have the Madrid Protocol, which invites you to try to do better. But we, as a small countries, we succeed of, doing the first zero emission, which means that now no country can say, no, this is not possible, because it's what people say. It's complicated, that's true, but it's possible. And by doing so, of course, you be part of the change. And I think that nowadays, this is important. We're not gonna it's make a miracle or something like this. The change will happen if we decide change our behavior regarding the way we are dealing with the energy. And we, as a small foundation and on education in Antarctica, as an entrepreneur, as an actor, we show that changing is not going backward, but it's going forward. And that's the main problem of our society. We are still completely minded by the fact that we have to produce more, that we have to just growing and growing. At the moment, we have to slow down. We have to reorganize our society, and especially because now we are about 8 billion on Earth, going to be even more in the coming decades, most probably. And we have to live on this planet. There are no plan B on Mars or whatever. This is not true. Space research is important because it can provide us with lots of technologies and everything. When I was young, I even had no TV. It was not existing. When you see in more than 60 years, all what was done is absolutely amazing. But what for? We are still thinking that we have to do more, etc. So that's the main problem of our society. And especially because the equality between people has to also be taken in account, because we live together and we have to. And looking at how dealing with the energy is reorganizing the way of the economy can be, guided, how socially people will have finally a job, etc. That's the main important. And it's complicated, but it's very interesting because it's the first time in history of human species that we know what we have to do to survive to ourselves, because the planet doesn't care about us. This planet will find another balance with us or without us. But for us, it's very interesting because will we be able tomorrow to put all this technology, the intelligence that we got as humans at the service of our survival on the planet? There are solutions. That's one thing. The other thing which is important is that why do we have to go to the poles, and especially to Antarctica? We have to go there because what we don't know yet, it's the speed of the change. Especially in our regions, we have, in Antarctica, it's a big glacier. So going slowly down towards the ocean, just remind people that when it goes on the ocean, it starts floating because there are still, some peaks under which is slowing down the glacier. And then at some time it breaks off, and it's this iceberg we are talking about, which of course have a direct effect on the sea level rise. But how it's gonna go in the peninsula, and if we look at the Antarctic, there are parts of the Antarctic very near to the South America where we can see the same kind of evolution that we have here in the Alps, in the Andes, in Greenland as well. But the main Antarctic is what we call the East Antarctica, where we are on the Atlantic coast for us. And this is the big mass of continental ice, which if they had to melt, it would raise the sea level of 57 meters. It's not going to happen like that, of course, because the Antarctic is surrounded by an ocean, but an ocean which is warming. And so the water is going under this kind of ice platform, drifting towards the ocean. So what's happening there? We don't know. We don't know exactly. We have to study that. It's very complicated. The ice, when it arrives at the end of the continent, what we call the grounding line, it has about 800 meters thick. And then it goes down to 400 and then nothing. So this huge question at the moment for which we need a solution, because we need time to be able to adapt our behavior, but also to adapt the way we are living along the coast.
Is this something that IPF working on right now?
No, we as International Polar Foundation, beside our activities of education, we are supporting the scientists. It means that we provide an infrastructure, a hub, a place from where you can work up to 100, 200, 1,000 kilometers in Antarctica. So we are working on a, let's say, terrain as big as France, more or less.
And what are your other future projects? In your website, I noticed that you're working on Andromeda Earth Observatory. Could you maybe talk about that briefly?
Princess Elizabeth is a small station. We can welcome about 50 people, which is not that small at all. It's the average in Antarctica, but the location is a small ridge, and the smart grid that we conceive can't be extended. So if we want to do one step ahead in the environmental performance, in all these kind of even space technology, that we could do that here on Earth and not in the space, we need a bigger place. That's one thing. And also we had to build a airport on the ice at 60 kilometers from the station to give independency access to the station for the Belgian. And so the Andromeda project is an international project. It's trying to give easier access, cheaper access to scientists from all over the world in a station which will be the most environmental station in Antarctica, developing different activities, setting up a university Antarctic research center with fundamental science, applied science, developing satellite activities, and really trying to open the Antarctic to scientists and not keeping that for one nation or something like that. The future will be if we learn how to better work together in this world, every level. And we see that today it's not that especially easy. So it's an additional reason for going and building such an Earth observatory, as we call that, because we need that.
When it comes to climate change in polar regions, also in the documentary that you were featured, there was this one data that in 2024, the world has lost 450 gigatons of ice. What I noticed is that in this interview, you are on a more constructive attitude. How do you keep being positive when everyone is so concerned and negative about climate change in polar regions?
Well, first of all, I think that no one can formally tell you what's going on in 50 years or 100 years. We know that the change will be, that's for sure. But what I find interesting in a society is the dynamic, around. I mean, we are all in a way, and more than ever, we have to becoming entrepreneur, including nations. And we also know that if people and if companies, big companies, don't want to change, politicians won't change, because the system more or less and differently all over the world. But unfortunately, our system is a short-term system, and we need long-term action. So the equation is difficult, but still remain the energy of the people and the companies. And I think that the revolution we have to work on is very interesting because it will have to bring the human in the middle of how, and this is the question, how will we be able to use the technology? That's it. It's an infinite challenge, which is very interesting. And so it's also, there's no solution if we don't take into consideration all the different generations. So it means that of course, we can be negative about the fact what's happening today. There are good things, bad things, conflict, etc. But it's part of history. It's part of human being. But as I said previously in our conversation, I mean, this is the first time that we know what to do. And the challenge is, can we do that together? And that's a very interesting challenge. That makes me optimistic. And so if you by chance, like me, had the huge privilege of being living and achieving some of my big dreams, I mean, for me, I never had expected in my life making little kids dreaming of becoming a polar explorer or being able to convince big entrepreneurs to change the way they are dealing with, their companies on different level. So it would be a pity if I was negative.
You being more constructive is also giving others hope, I assume. My last question is, and we have been talking for almost half an hour, thank you very much for that. My colleague Mikhail came up with this question and I really liked it. In terms of science communication, it is always important to give clear messages. If you had 2 minutes with the EU leaders, what concrete decision would you urge them to make to protect the poles?
I mean, the poles, and in particular the Antarctic, is the place to go tomorrow, because this is in Antarctica that we have to be able to get a better understanding about the speed of the change. That's one thing. The other thing is that the climate in general that we have in this planet between the low atmosphere and the Earth is an exchange between the ocean, the atmosphere and the continent. And it's an exchange between cold and heat. And there are only two sources of cold. The North Pole, which is changing now. In the summer, it's retracting, and of course, in the polar night, dark, and the ice is coming, but it's disappearing. So, but in Antarctica is the main cold source of the climate. This is very important for the balance of the climate. And we see now that we have more and more extreme events on climate, and this is a signal. The other thing is that science is important as it provides fact. And these facts will give us information about the time that we'll have to make this change happen. And it's a positive change by the end of the day. And I'm fed up to hear that we always have to wait for an extreme catastrophic event to say, oh yes, we have to change. I mean, are we stupid as human? What makes a difference between a human and an animal? This is our capabilities of, understanding what's happening and making a decision. And this is the future.
That was Alain Hubert, a true pioneer, reminding us that real change begins with vision and courage. If you enjoyed this episode of Everything is Changing by Revolve, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, do not forget, perspective is everything, and everything is changing.